Greetings! I am Sally Charrington, and on behalf of the Allen Organ Company, I would like to welcome you to this video on basic hymn playing. This is the third in our series of educational videos. The first video deals with manual and pedal technique, while the second discusses historical registration. Before we examine the mechanics of hymn playing, let's take a few moments to consider the role of the organ in worship, since this will affect the choices we make in playing hymns and liturgy each Sunday. In the United States, the organ was used during worship services in only a few denominations until the 19th century. Before this time, most congregations sang without instrumental accompaniment, and there was no incidental music such as preludes or offertories. Organs were introduced initially in most churches as a way to improve congregational singing, which was in a deplorable state. Gradually, the leadership role of the organ and organist increased to include accompanying a choir and providing other instrumental service music. It is important to keep this background in mind when we approach our own tasks of preparing for Sunday morning. Inspirational preludes are wonderful, but our primary responsibility is to assist the singers in their musical worship. The organist can do this by developing both a technical and interpretive game plan for each musical element of the service. Think about it. In some denominations, the time spent singing the hymns, liturgy, and other service music can add up to half of the worship time. This means that the way in which the organist leads and interprets this music becomes critical to the atmosphere of the worship experience. The congregation is called upon to sing different things in churches of different denominations, which may include hymns, liturgy, psalmody, and other service music. In this video, we will focus on hymns, although the concepts that will be discussed can be easily adapted to accompany other liturgical music as well. We will use a wide variety of hymnody, from traditional to gospel to contemporary, chosen from a sampling of current hymnals that represent many of the major denominations. Let's begin with a quick review of the hymnal and its various indices. For this overview, we will use the Lutheran Book of Worship, or LBW as it is commonly called, since it contains the types of indices found in most hymnals. Since Lutherans observe the liturgical church year, the indices in this hymnal, which start on page 929, begin with the section Hymns for the Church Year, which suggests several hymns appropriate to the readings for every Sunday. The next two indices require little explanation. One is a topical index, which lists hymns by subject category, and the next, an index of the hymns by authors, composers, and sources of both tunes and texts. Each hymn in the hymnal has both a title and a tune name. The title of the hymn is the first line of the text that is most commonly associated with that tune. Here, the Church is one foundation. Virtually all hymnals have an index wherein you can find hymns by their title or first line. The hymn tune is the name of the tune or melody itself. Aurelia is the name of the tune for this hymn. It is usually printed in capital letters, either at the bottom of the hymn in the hymnal, as in the LBW, or at the top, as in this hymnal, Hymns for the Family of God. The tune name is crucial, since hymn texts vary greatly between hymnals or even within the same hymnal. For example, Aurelia appears elsewhere in the LBW, number 197, with the communion text, O Living Bread from Heaven. The tune name will help you to locate introductions, free hymn harmonizations, and preludes based on your hymns. It will also help you to find the same hymn tune in another key. For example, suppose you had a special introduction for The Church is One Foundation in the key of D major, but you discovered that the hymn with its original text is in E-flat major, number 369. If you looked at the other settings of the same tune in the hymnal, you would find that number 197 is set in the key of D major, so you could play the harmonies from that page instead. The final index with which you should familiarize yourself is the Metrical Tunes Index. It has strange-looking categories whose names are a series of capital letters like CMD or numbers like 557, 558. These are references to the poetic meter of the hymn. The numbers refer to the number of syllables in each line of the text. You probably know the hymn, Beautiful Savior, or Fairest Lord Jesus. The first phrase, Beautiful Savior, has 5 syllables, as does the next phrase, King of Creation. The next line, Son of God and Son of Man, increases the number of syllables to 7. If we analyze the entire first verse, we will come up with a metrical form of 557-558. If we look in the metrical index for the numbers beginning with 5, we will see this meter followed by the number of Beautiful Savior in the LBW, 518. Similarly, the meter is listed at the bottom or top of the hymn. The letters in this index are abbreviations for the most commonly used meters. In fact, CM means common meter and is the abbreviation, as shown in the index, for a 4-line stanza of 8-6-8-6 syllables. O God, our help in ages past is a good example of a hymn in common meter. How is this useful beyond organist trivial pursuit matches? Perhaps you find yourself humming a hymn tune, but you cannot remember the name of the tune or any of the text. You can figure out the meter, check the index, and substantially narrow down the possibilities. Or suppose you have a new hymn text that fits perfectly into your Sunday service, but you need to match it with a familiar tune. The metrical index will help you here as well. Now that you have mastered the nuts and bolts of the hymnal, it's time to move on to hymn playing. There are many factors to consider in deciding how to play a hymn on a particular Sunday in a particular church. These include the style of the music, the nature of the text, the placement of the hymn in the order of worship, and in many denominations, the liturgical season, such as Lent or Easter. Other factors involve the congregation you are accompanying, the size of the community, the average age of the singers, the congregation's musical traditions, and the pacing of the pastor. There are also physical elements to consider, such as the type of organ and its placement in the room, and the size and acoustics of the building. Even the weather and the time of day of the gathering affect congregational singing and therefore hymn accompaniment. Your decisions about these factors, whether conscious or unconscious, are translated to the congregation in the way you handle 6 key components of hymn performance. Number 1, pedaling and fingering. Number 2, tempo. Number 3, phrasing. Number 4, articulation and breaking of repeated notes. Number 5, registration. And number 6, creativity. We will analyze each of these components in detail, investigating how you can make them work together to create inspirational hymn accompaniments. Let's begin with pedaling and fingering. Contrary to popular belief, hymns are not the easiest music to play on the organ. They are some of the most difficult pieces to play well. Therefore, you will want to work out the fingering and pedaling as carefully as you would for your offertory solo. When you play a 4-voice hymn, you should play the top 2 voices, the soprano and alto, in your right hand, and the upper note in the bass clef, the tenor line, in your left hand. I will demonstrate this on the first phrase of the hymn, Come, Great God of All the Ages, a setting of the tune Abbott's Lay in the Presbyterian hymnal. The lowest part, the bass line, should be played by the pedals exclusively. Your left hand should not double the bass line for 2 reasons. First, this will throw off the volume balance of the parts, making the bass line louder than the other voices. Second, there are often large melodic or harmonic intervals in the bass and tenor parts, making it difficult to play these parts together smoothly with the left hand alone without the assistance of the piano's damper pedal. For example, look at the 3rd measure of this hymn, 4 consecutive intervals of a tenth in the bass clef. It would be extremely difficult to play these 4 intervals in a legato style and up to tempo with the left hand alone. Begin practicing the hymn by playing all parts as legato as possible. This means that in the hands, you may need to use not only good fingering, but also some keyboard techniques specific to the organ, such as substitution and thumb glissandos. Substitution involves striking a note with one finger, then changing to another finger while holding the note down. Thumb glissandos are little slides between notes. It also means that you will need to use both the toes, or really the ball of the foot, and heels of both feet in order to play the bass line smoothly. Listen to the difference in another hymn in the Presbyterian hymnal, Be Thou My Vision, or Slain, number 339, as I play first with just the toe of the left foot, then with the toes and heels of both feet. Of course, your feet also need to be wearing proper organ shoes, which will assist your toe-heel pedaling and prevent you from injuring yourself. If you have questions about these basic techniques, our first video on basic manual and pedal techniques covers them in more detail. Be sure that you are playing the pedal line in the octave in which it is written. For example, if the chord shows the F on the 4th line of the bass clef, you need to play this F on the pedal board, not the F an octave lower. Dropping all of the pedal notes into the bottom octave makes it difficult to play the pedal line smoothly and accurately, and can also create some very unusual bass progressions. Playing the entire pedal line down an octave can be an effective way to add drama to a final verse, but it is an effect that should be used sparingly. Listen to part of the hymn All People That on Earth Do Dwell, or Old Hundredth, number 220, played first with the pedal part in the upper octave, then down an octave for a dramatic close. Another easy and striking option is to begin playing the last verse with all voices playing the melody in octaves, with the pedal in the lowest octave of the pedal board. Now that you are able to play the basic notes smoothly in your hands and feet, let's move on to the tempo. You need to have the tempo firmly chosen in your head before you let your limbs become involved. You will want to consider many of the factors that we discussed earlier in determining your tempo, but once you have set a tempo, you need to stick with it. Remember that you are leading the congregation, not vice versa. The most important factor in establishing the tempo is the introduction. We will discuss creative introductions later in this video, but be sure that no matter what musical material you choose to play to introduce the hymn, it must be played at the same speed at which you want the congregation to sing. Slowing down at the end of the introduction to cue the congregation is asking for trouble. The break between the introduction and the first verse must also be in tempo. This is particularly important in hymns with a slow tempo, such as Spirit of God, Descend Upon My Heart, to the tune Morecambe, shown here in the Methodist hymnal, number 500. is also important to maintain the tempo between the verses. This means the final chord of a verse must be released early in order to allow the congregation time to breathe. If you do not allow the congregation time to breathe, they will breathe anyway, with the result that the next verse will probably begin late, pulling back the tempo. Some hymns pose special problems in maintaining the tempo between verses because they end on short note values. The hymn, My Hope is Built on Nothing Less, LBW number 294, sung to the tune Melita, is sung at a moderate tempo and ends on a quarter note. Cutting the length of the final note to an eighth note, thereby allowing an eighth rest in which to breathe, and then going on with the pickup to the next verse, will make for a very abrupt transition, which will leave most congregational singers in the dust. In a case like this, it may be better to extend the length of the final note by an amount of time that makes sense in the meter and tempo of the hymn. In this case, try making the final note 2 beats, followed by a quarter note rest. This is particularly helpful for the singers in an unfamiliar hymn. Some hymnals, such as the Baptist hymnal, suggest this by placing a fermata over the last note when it is unusually short. If you still feel like you are having difficulty keeping the tempo moving in a hymn, think about the acoustics of the room, the instrument, and the location of the choir. If you are playing an upbeat hymn in a room which is acoustically live, for example, you may need to play in a more detached fashion, particularly in the soprano and bass voices. We will discuss this further in the upcoming section on breaking of repeated notes. Be sure that the registration you select is bright enough to be heard clearly by the congregation, particularly if you have an older, tubby-sounding instrument or one that lacks a definitive attack at the beginning of each note. Or you may be able to diagnose a tempo dragging problem by noting the location of the choir. Perhaps the choir is processing or sitting where they cannot hear the organ clearly, or where the sound of the organ arrives after a slight delay. Since the congregation often relies on the choir for musical leadership in the worship service, this may cause tempo difficulties. This can often be solved by simple forethought, such as asking the individual choir members to hold off singing the opening hymn until they have processed far enough into the sanctuary to hear the organ clearly. The next component we have to work with in interpreting hymns is phrasing. Conscientious phrasing both reinforces the tempo by allowing the congregation time to breathe within each phrase and interprets the text. For example, let's look at the difference in meaning a shrewdly placed break can effect in the familiar Advent hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, or Veni Emmanuel, number 34 in the LBW. The refrain contains the text, Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel. The approximate length of the phrases in the verse of the hymn, as well as the longer note value on the last note of Emmanuel, cause most singers to breathe after that word. This creates a phrase, Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel, which suggests that it is Emmanuel, not Israel, that should be doing the rejoicing. What we really want is to sound forth the call, Rejoice, rejoice, followed by the reason. Emmanuel shall come to you, O Israel. Phrasing is created, therefore, first in your mind, by reading through the hymn texts, thinking about them, and deciding how the phrasing could best help to communicate their meaning. This means that each verse of a hymn may call for different phrasing. For example, let's look at the hymn For the Beauty of the Earth, Dix, the first hymn in Hymns for the Family of God. A good place to begin with phrasing is by taking a break at punctuation points. The first verse would then sound like this. This concept works effectively for the first verse. However, do not assume that you should always break at a comma. For example, listen to the result if we naively apply that rule to verse 3 of this hymn. Phrasing and punctuation, therefore, is a good starting point, but it is not a rule to be adhered to slavishly. With distractions like nervous ushers, crying children, unpredictable sound systems, and clumsy worship assistants on Sunday mornings, it never hurts to pencil in your desired phrasing on each verse in your hymnal. Next, it is time to practice making audible phrases at the console. The organ is the only wind instrument that can breathe indefinitely, or at least until someone pulls the plug. So it is important that we do not give our congregations the same impression that the great Russian composer Stravinsky had of the organ, when he commented, "The organ is the beast that never breathes." Work out the phrasing on a hymn and try recording yourself playing it with the recording device in the middle of the room. Even easier, if your organ has a built-in sequencer or recording device right at the console, just press record and begin playing a hymn. When you are done recording, walk away from the organ console to listen to the music the way the congregation hears it. This will assure that you are not only thinking, but also playing the phrases. The organist can create the effect of the ending of a phrase in two different ways. The first and most common is by inserting a break into the music at the end of a textual phrase by shortening the length of the final chord in all the voices. The amount of shortening depends on the tempo, acoustics, organ, and the desired impact of the break. In performing For the Beauty of the Earth, you might allow a smaller break after the second measure and a larger one after the fourth measure. The second option in defining a phrase is to break only the soprano line for a less pronounced effect. This would be a good choice for a hymn or verse of a hymn that has many short phrases, particularly in a room with dead acoustics, where the breaks would sound very distinct. Let's try this on the last verse of For the Beauty of the Earth. Another category of breaks that requires special attention in hymn playing is that of breaking repeated notes. In playing organ literature, we generally put a separation between repeated notes in all voices. However, in hymn playing, this is not always the case. Many hymns will sound too choppy, particularly in a less acoustic sanctuary, if each repeated note is distinctly separated. The organist is left with a number of options, each of which will have a different interpretive effect. One option is to break only repeated notes in the soprano voice, tying together all repeated notes in other voices. This would work well for a prayerful hymn in which you want to maintain a very legato feeling. I will play Fairest Lord Jesus, or the Crusaders hymn, number 240, in Hymns for the Family of God, both ways, first with the breaks observed in all voices. Now I will break only the repeated notes in the soprano voice. Let's return to the Church's one foundation, Aurelia, to experiment with some other possibilities. The opening measure and a half of this hymn is a hotbed of repeated notes. It would be possible to play this by inserting breaks only between the repeated soprano notes and tying all other repeated notes. However, some subtle changes in the treatment of these repeated notes can energize this hymn and make it sound more like a joyful hymn of praise. This time, let's try breaking the repeated notes in both the soprano and tenor voices, while tying all of the repeated notes in the alto voice and most of those in the bass, as shown here. This will give the opening of the hymn more propulsion and help to establish the tempo, a necessity for an opening hymn that begins with repeated chords. If the hymn is opening an early morning service and you want to be sure to keep the congregation with you, try breaking the soprano and bass repeated notes on the first verse while tying the inner voices. The soprano and the bass are the two parts that the average singer can hear and therefore respond to most easily. Remember to listen carefully to the result you are achieving to see if it is compatible with the style and text of the hymn. Observing the breaks in more of the voices can give the hymn a livelier effect and help to drive a sluggish congregation. But too many breaks can make the organist sound like they would rather be playing the piano and are sorely missing the damper pedal. We will now move on to one of the most important components of exciting hymn playing, registration. Let's start with some fundamental approaches to hymn registration. If you need more help with basic registration, you will find more detailed rudimentary assistance in our video, A Church Organist's Primer, Part 2, Registration. Let's begin by taking a closer look at this organ console. This is a 2-manual console with stop tabs for controlling each of its 50 stops. The stops for the great, or lower manual, are to the right. The stops for the swell, or upper manual, are in the middle, and the pedal stops are located to the left. This particular instrument has quite an extensive capture system, which enables the organist to set 10 general and 6 divisional pistons in a system of 4 memories. It is certainly helpful to have this generous variety of stops, as well as so many programmable pistons at your disposal. However, you can create varied and effective registrations even with a much more limited instrument. We will begin by setting 5 general pistons, which are all appropriate for hymns. Remember that the designation of general pistons means that the control is able to capture stops in all divisions of the organ. In order to make these 5 pistons easy to use within the service, we will create registrations which gradually progress from a soft but supportive sound on number 1 to a loud, bright sound on number 5. We will start with piston number 1. The foundation of all hymn and liturgy registrations is the 8-foot principal stop on the Great Manual. As we build our registrations, we will be using mostly principals and flutes. So let's add the following 8-foot stops on the swell, gedeckt 8 and viola 8. Even though we want to keep this first piston relatively soft, we need to add some 4-foot stops. Perhaps the 4-foot Koppelflöte on the swell, and the 4-foot Spitzflöte on the great. Remember that 8-foot stops play the same pitch as the piano, and therefore the same octave in which the congregation is singing. When you add 4-foot stops, you are adding pitches which are sounding 1 octave higher, making it easier for the congregation to hear these notes. Next, we are going to add the swell to great coupler. This means that all stops which are engaged on the top manual will also sound when you play on the great. This will give us a fuller sound on the great and provide more contrast between the keyboards. Finally, we need to set a registration for the pedals. The pedal stops that you choose for each registration must balance what you are using in the manuals. For example, on piston number 1, we have chosen mostly 8-foot stops with a few light 4-foot stops in the manuals. Therefore, in the pedals, we will use some of the 16-foot stops, reserving the heaviest 16-foot sounds for the louder combinations, as well as some lighter 8-foot stops. You will see that as we add higher pitches in the manual divisions, we will also add fuller and brighter stops in the pedals. This will keep the sound from becoming top-heavy and provide a solid foundation for congregational singing. Before we move on, let's discuss 16-foot stops for a moment. In playing hymns, you should always have on at least one 16-foot stop in the pedal division. This is what adds the lower octave that provides the bass effect. Without 16-foot stops in the pedals, it will sound as if you are not playing the bass notes in the pedal. After all, you don't want all of your fancy footwork to be wasted. In the manual divisions, however, you should not use any of the 16-foot stops in hymn registrations. These stops have very special uses and will make the texture too muddy in normal hymn playing. Here, then, is the final registration for piston number 1. The stops on your organ probably do not have exactly the same names as those on this instrument, but you can recreate a similar registration by substituting other stops which are from the same family and pitch level. This sound works well for prayerful or Lenten hymns, or for softer verses within a hymn. I will play one verse of the Lenten folk hymn, Jesus Walked This Lonesome Valley, from the Catholic Worship 3 hymnal, number 427. To create pistons numbers 2 through 5, we will gradually add stops of progressively higher pitches. On piston number 2, let's add to the stops that were on for piston number 1 the 4-foot principals on both keyboards, as well as the swell to pedal coupler. I will also substitute the octave 8-foot for the Gedachtflöte 8-foot in the pedals. Piston number 3 adds the 2-foot stops in the swelling grade. Here, the Blockflöte and superoctave, and Waldflöte. In the pedal division, I will select the principal chorus, the diapason 16, octave 8, and choral bass 4, as well as the great to pedal. Remember that the pedal stops need to keep building in step with the manual combinations. Piston number 4 includes the stops on piston number 3 plus the great mixture, here a 4-rank mixture. In the pedal, I will add the Bourdon 16. Finally, on piston number 5, we will add the mixture and the 8-foot trumpet on the swell. We will also add a light 8-foot reed in the pedal, the Trompetta 8, to give more definition to the pedal line. Here is the progression of sound that we have created. These 5 pistons will provide you with a basic color palette to interpret hymn verses and parts of the liturgy. As you approach a hymn, think of the basic character you want to portray. Is it a hymn of praise, penitence, witness? Then look at the individual verses and see if the focus of the text varies throughout the hymn. Now you are ready to match piston numbers to the verses. For example, let's look at the hymn At the Name of Jesus, sung in many denominations, to the tune King's Weston. We will use the setting from the United Methodist hymnal, number 168, which has 4 verses. Since this is a triumphant dramatic hymn, it needs to begin with a full commanding sound. Let's try using piston number 4 for the first verse. The second verse speaks of Jesus being humbled on the cross before his victorious return. This might suggest a softer registration, like piston number 3. So, after playing the last phrase of the first verse on piston number 4, try releasing the final chord after 2 beats. During the beat of rest, before beginning verse 2, you will hit piston number 3. Verses 3 and 4 both have triumphant texts. In order to create a sense of climax on the last verse, you might try going back to piston 4 for verse 3, then changing to piston number 5 for the closing verse. Here is the end of verse 3, played on piston number 4, going into verse 4, accompanied by piston number 5. There are other ways to change sounds between verses besides using these 5 general pistons. An easy change is accomplished by adding or removing the swell to great coupler. Next, suppose you are playing How Great Thou Art, number 2 in Hymns for the Family of God. The text to the third verse is introspective, suggesting a softer registration. Instead of changing pistons, try simply changing keyboards from the great to the swell. That way you can switch back to the great on the refrain. This is a particularly effective technique on a 3-manual organ, which offers the organist even more color possibilities without ever hitting a piston. Let's take a look at a 3-manual console. While a 3-manual console may initially look more confusing with its additional stops and console controls, it can actually make registration changes easier. The swell and grate on this organ are comparable to those on the 2-manual I have been using. But here we have the added bonus of the choir division with its own complement of principals, flutes, mixture, and reeds. Therefore, in setting general hymn playing pistons, follow the same basic concepts that I outlined earlier. Begin with 8-foot and light 4-foot stops, and gradually add stops of greater volume and higher pitch levels. By including the swell to choir 8-foot and choir to great 8-foot couplers, you will now have 3 graduated levels of volume on every piston. For example, general piston number 3 on this organ might offer these possibilities. Using the 3 manuals judiciously may also allow you to plan ahead for a hymn tune solo on one of the verses. Here we have a powerful festival trumpet on the choir, which could be used for a spicy trumpet solo on one verse. On the swell, I have chosen the trumpet 8-foot, which I will use for an introductory trumpet fanfare. I will set a full registration on the grate, which I will use to play the first verse on the grate. For the second verse, I will play the soprano voice on the choir trumpet, accompanied by the alto and tenor voices on the grate, and the bass in the pedal. This means that I can create 3 different effects for the introduction and first and second verses without having to hit a piston. Manual organs also offer more possibilities for colorful solo voices, especially for hymn introductions. This instrument, for example, contains an hautbois or 8-foot oboe on the swell, not found on the 2 manual, which would make a beautiful solo accompanied by the choir Erzähler and Erzähler Celeste. You may have noticed that this organ has many additional couplers. Alan has added superoctave and suboctave couplers on this instrument. Superoctave couplers are those with 4 in their names, such as swell to grate 4. They transfer stops at the octave above their original pitch. For example, an 8-foot and 4-foot stop combination on the swell becomes a 4-foot and 2-foot combination on the grate using this superoctave coupler. Suboctave or 16-foot couplers work in the opposite direction, lowering the original pitch of the stops by 1 octave. Suboctave couplers are not used in hymn playing for the same reason as 16-foot stops. They make the sound too muddy. Superoctave couplers should only be used for hymns if you have a small organ that lacks brightness and upper work, such as mixtures, where the sound can become too sharp and brittle. We will return now to our 2 manual organ and our discussion of basic ways to create color changes within hymns. A final possibility is to use the divisional pistons on your organ. If your organ has divisional pistons, they are usually located directly under the center of each keyboard, where they are sometimes easier to reach than the general pistons. You can set your divisional pistons using the same concepts that we used in setting the general pistons. Start with 8-foot and light 4-foot pitches and gradually build up the sound. Remember that since you are only changing the stops on one keyboard, the audible effect will be more subtle than when you are changing all of the divisions simultaneously with the general piston. Sometimes a hymn text will strongly suggest its own special registration. Let's look at the battle hymn in the Baptist hymnal, here entitled "Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory," number 633. The 3rd verse declares, "He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never sound retreat." Here's an opportunity to reinforce the text literally with your choice of tonal colors. First, we will set a registration with a trumpet solo and an accompaniment of principals. I will play the melody on the trumpet stop on the swell with my right hand. I will read the alto and tenor voices with my left hand on the accompanimental stops on the grate, leaving the bass part for the pedals. When we put it all together, we get a rousing trumpet solo. This registration is effective for many lively hymns as well as hymn introductions. The above suggestions are also appropriate for use with portions of the liturgy. For example, the Sanctus, or Holy Holy, could be played with general piston number 4, while the Agnus Dei, or Lamb of God, would be more appropriately accompanied with pistons number 1 or number 2. Most of the hymns that we have discussed thus far are representative of the large body of traditional hymnody from the Protestant or Catholic traditions. Let's take a brief look at some tips for playing some of the contemporary hymnody, which is now appearing in many hymnals. The term contemporary hymnody is actually a catch-all for a wide variety of new congregational song, which has its roots in American folk and popular music, as well as international ethnic music. There is also a wonderful body of contemporary hymnody, which is written in a more traditional 4-part harmonic style, but with fresh new texts. Much of the contemporary hymnody can be registered using the same principles we discussed before, particularly the final category of hymns, which are written in a traditional style. For example, let's look at a hymn in the Episcopal Hymnal 1982, number 490, I Want to Walk as a Child of the Light, sung to the tune Houston. This hymn has 3 verses, each of which consists of a verse and refrain. The texts of the verses seem to build in intensity to the last verse, so you may want to make each consecutive verse louder than the previous one. Since newer hymns are often less familiar to the congregation, it would be an excellent idea to solo out the melody on the first verse. You do not need to have a loud trumpet stop to do this effectively. Try using one of the 5 general pistons we selected previously, playing the melody on the grate as a solo voice, and the accompaniment on the swell and pedal. When you get to the refrain, move both hands to the grate for more fullness. I will play the first verse in this manner using general piston number 3. Since this hymn contains a great deal of imagery referring to light, stars, etc., it would be a good candidate for using a special stop found on some organs, a zimbalstern. A zimbalstern is a device which has several bells hanging from it. When it is activated, it spins, causing the bells to ring randomly and continuously until it is turned off. This organ can create a zimbalstern effect through the use of a MIDI device called the Allen MDS expander. MIDI is an abbreviation for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. We do not have time to go into the amazing potential of MIDI in this video. The Allen MDS expander can be used to create not only a wide variety of bell and percussion effects, but also a myriad of other solo and ensemble voices with impressive accuracy. I will play the refrain of I Want to Walk as a Child of the Light with the zimbalstern. It is a charming effect if used sparingly. Zimbelstern is particularly effective with a verse of a Christmas carol. Another possibility is to add it during the Sanctus of the liturgy on festival Sundays. Some contemporary hymnody, particularly that which has its basis in popular music, has accompaniments which are pianistic in character. We will look at two examples, a basic one and a more challenging one. First is the hymn, "You Satisfy the Hungry Heart," seen here as number 736 in Worship 3, but also found in a number of other contemporary hymnals. Let's look first at the mechanics of playing this piece on the organ. The hymn consists of a refrain which, unlike most gospel hymns, begins and ends the hymn, and 5 verses. The refrain opens with 2 notes which gradually unfold into 4-part harmony. Notice that this means that the opening bass note is quite high on the pedal board. If you drop the opening bass note down an octave, you will destroy the beautiful effect of the piece opening up that the composer has created. You can treat the refrain like the average hymn and play the bass part and the pedals throughout in the octave in which it is written. Another option is to consider the idea that it is not always necessary to play pedals throughout a hymn. Try playing all of the notes in the manuals until you get to the second half of the refrain, adding the pedals at the phrase, "Come give to us." This will preserve the effect of the opening and add drama at the point where the pedal enters. You might also try this second approach at the opening of the verse, which again begins with 2-part harmony, which expands to 3 and then 4 parts. Some contemporary hymns, such as this one, seem to be enhanced by a warm registration. You may have noticed in our discussion of hymn registrations that we have avoided the use of strings. This is because the goal in registering hymns is to create articulate sounds which will clearly communicate the pitch and rhythm to the congregation while reinforcing the meaning of the text. String stops by themselves are not particularly problematic, but when the string is paired with its partner celeste stop, the result is a warmer, less focused sound created by the fact that the celeste stop is actually slightly out of tune with the string stop. In general hymn playing, therefore, it is best to avoid using string and flute celestes in registrations, particularly if your congregation has a tendency to drag, or if the organ does not speak clearly into the room. On occasion, however, some of the celestes can be combined with principals and flutes to create a more romantic sound, which works well for some verses of a hymn, like "You Satisfy the Hungry Heart," as well as for many folk hymns. Let's use the following stops. Some accompaniments adapt to the organ less comfortably. Let's consider the increasingly popular hymn, "On Eagle's Wings." A few hymnals modify pianistic accompaniments for the organist. Here we see "On Eagle's Wings" in the Baptist hymnal, number 71, although only the refrain has been included. Notice in particular the tenor and bass notes, which are in long note values that would be easily played with the left hand and pedal. The markings in the alto part indicate that some of the alto notes should be played by the left hand to maintain the legato. For example, this note is picked up by the left hand, then these 3 with the right hand. Most hymnals, however, print the full accompaniment, as shown here in Gather, a contemporary hymnal published by GIA. We do not have time to work through all of the specific challenges posed by this piece, but there are a few basic concepts to keep in mind. First, do not try to play all of the notes of a moving left-hand part in the pedals. Try holding the first bass note of the measure in the pedal until the harmony changes, and play the moving notes with your left hand. Try to eliminate doubled notes, especially high consecutive octaves in the right hand. When you are playing stops at 8-foot and 4-foot pitch, you are automatically playing octaves already. And be particularly careful in accompaniments such as this one if the congregation will sing the verses as well as the refrain. Listen to the first phrase of the melody. In congregational song, where the accompaniment is completely independent of the melody, it is best if the congregation hears the melody sung a number of times by a soloist or by the choir. The first few times the congregation does the singing, you may want to modify the accompaniment so that you play the melody on a solo voice on one keyboard, some form of the manual accompaniment with your left hand on the other keyboard, and the bass and the pedals. Finally, let's explore a sample ethnic hymn. Many hymnals now incorporate a cross-section of Asian, African, Latin American, and Caribbean songs and hymns. You may want to experiment with performing some of these hymns on native instruments, particularly percussion instruments. If you decide to use the organ instead or in addition, you need to, as always, choose the registration to complement the flavor of the hymn. Perhaps you are going to experiment with number 214 in the LBW, Come Let Us Eat. This is an African hymn, avade, in a call and response style. Originally, the leader would sing the first and third phrases, echoed by the group in the second and fourth phrases. Why not try emulating that effect by having your choir sing the call lines and the congregation the response lines? Your registration should support this division of labor. Try setting bright, transparent sounds on both keyboards, adding the swell to great and great to pedal. Accompany the choir on the swell without the pedals, then the congregation on the great with the pedals. Again, remember that featuring the melody on a colorful sound on a separate keyboard is extremely helpful in presenting new ethnic hymnody. Now that you're an expert on playing hymns, let's look at some ideas for introducing those hymns to the congregation. The introduction must provide the congregation with vital information, the tune, tempo, style, and key of the upcoming hymn, in an understandable manner. In fact, when hymn or chorale singing first became popular in churches, hymnals included only texts without tunes, making the role of the introduction in presenting the tune particularly critical. Imagine hearing this chorale prelude by Buxtehude on Sunday morning as the lead-in to a hymn that is still popular today in most churches. Did you recognize the first two phrases of "A Mighty Fortress is Our God"? Remember that while it is exciting to present creative introductions, it is important to not lose sight of their necessary function for the congregation. We talked previously about the need to keep a steady tempo between the introduction and the first verse, as well as providing time within the tempo for the congregation to breathe. In terms of registration, a basic concept is that the introduction should be slightly softer than the first verse, perhaps one piston to the left in the 5-piston plan we set previously. In other words, if you plan to play the first verse on piston number 4, then play the introduction on piston number 3. This gives the congregation a tonal cue when it is their turn to sing, without jarring them out of the pews with a huge, abrupt increase in volume. There are many ways to be creative with hymn introductions. In fact, with many congregations, this is the best place to begin experimenting with new techniques, since you can try new ways of interpreting the hymn without distracting the congregation while they are singing. We will have time here to touch on only a few of the many inventive ways you can play hymn introductions, but remember that some of these techniques can also be used during the hymn with a congregation that sings well. First, the method that I demonstrated earlier of soloing out a melody is very effective for introductions. You can be much freer in your choice of colors because you do not need to worry about having a registration full enough to support the singing. Think about the type of sound you would try to create if you were arranging the introduction for an orchestra in order to set the proper mood for the hymn. Try introducing "We Three Kings," number 128 in the Episcopal hymnal, with a pungent reed solo such as a crumb horn or English horn, accompanied by light flutes. Experiment with using stops at pitch levels other than 8-foot as solo voices. 4-foot flute stops with the tremulant added can create a haunting introduction for a hymn like "Beautiful Savior." Don't forget that you can substitute the cornet for a reed solo to create an exotic effect. The cornet consists of the flutes at 8-foot, 4-foot, 2 2/3 foot, 2-foot, and 1 3/5 foot pitch. You can also put your chimes to use in the introduction, either by themselves or echoing or accompanying an ensemble on another keyboard. This organ has very effective digital chimes, complete with accurate attack and decay. Ensemble registrations can also work well in introductions. Many of the older chorale-based hymns are written in bar form, wherein the first line is repeated. Let's set a full principal chorus on the grate and a reed chorus on the swell, and experiment with the introduction to Now Thank We All Our God, shown here in the Baptist hymnal, number 638. The same approach also works well with less traditional hymnody and a more romantic registration. Or try some registration imagery. You can create your own tonal sunrise on a morning hymn like Morning Has Broken, number 5 in Hymns for the Family of God, by using piston and keyboard changes to start the hymn introduction softly and gradually build to the dawn. Another way to construct an introduction that builds is to work with the notes rather than the registrations. Let's try this with the hymn, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, number 376 in the Episcopal hymnal. I will play only the soprano on the first phrase, then add the alto part on the second phrase, the tenor on the third, and finally the pedals on the final line. This is a particularly useful technique on those sleepy Sunday mornings when you are faced with an unfamiliar opening hymn that you are leery of diving into on all fours. This idea of eliminating certain parts has a myriad of possibilities for introductions. For example, try alternating duets with 4-part harmony in Christ the Lord is Risen Today, Alleluia. If you have a light bell stop on your organ, like this swell Celesta, another easy technique is to create a music box effect by accompanying the melody with an Alberti bass left hand, a la Mozart. This is particularly appropriate for some Christmas carols like Away in a Manger. There are many excellent volumes of hymn introductions and preludes available. Besides being useful themselves, they are a good way to fire your imagination for approaches that you can try on your own. Remember to ascertain that the introduction is in the character, tempo, and of course key of the hymn or response you are introducing. Before we close, let's look at one final tool that an organist can use to enrich hymn singing, particularly to build tension before a dramatic final verse, modulating up a key. There are a number of excellent books available which feature printed modulations between the penultimate and final verses, as well as providing the hymn harmonization in the starting and finishing keys. Here is an easy way you can do this by yourself. Let's look at the hymn, Praise to the Lord the Almighty, Loba den Herren. We will use the LBW because it has a straightforward version without accidentals in the key of F major, number 543. We will be moving between the keys of F major, 1 flat, and F sharp major, 6 sharps, between verses 3 and 4. It is a good idea to begin the modulating interlude while the congregation is holding the final note. Here, a dotted half note, which will cue them that something different is about to happen. Try using some melodic material from the hymn to begin the interlude, but avoid using the opening notes of the next verse. Otherwise, the congregation will think that you are just in a hurry to begin the final verse and go out for coffee. We will begin our short interlude with the opening chords of the final phrase. This will work out well since this phrase begins on an F major chord, the same as the final chord of the verse for which it will be substituting. Now, if I start playing on the third line of the third verse of the hymn, this is what we have so far. Now we are simply going to go back and repeat those 6 chords and the final measure in the new key of F sharp major, reading from the same score, but adding F, C, G, D, A, and E sharp. We are now ready to play the final verse up a half step in F sharp major. This will be an easier process on a hymn such as this, which has no accidentals to confuse the issue. I will now play again from the middle of the third verse, but this time I will play the interlude with the key change and begin the final verse. More subtle modulations are achieved by working out interludes wherein the organist approaches the new key through a pivot chord, a chord common to both keys, and then seals the new key with a cadence of dominant to tonic. The dominant chord is the major chord built on the 5th note of the scale, while the tonic chord is built on the 1st note of the scale. If you have even a basic knowledge of theory, I hope you will experiment with the possibilities. Unfortunately, we will have to leave that for another video. Transposer devices, which are now found on many organs, can be very useful in modulations. This organ has a 12-key transposer, making it possible to move up by 5 or down by 7 keys in half steps by simply turning this knob. Suppose you were playing a hymn in the key of B major, which has 5 sharps, and wanted to modulate up a half step for the final verse to the key of C major. This means that you could not use the method we just discussed of reading from the same hymnal, but thinking new accidentals, since the notes will be different. If you are uncomfortable with transposing at sight, you could finish the penultimate verse in B major, play the modulation, then during the breath before the final verse, turn the transposer up 1 click or 1 key. You could then play the last verse from the original music in B major, but the organ would be sounding in C major. I hope that this brief introduction has left you with a better understanding of the many challenges and possibilities in playing hymnody and liturgy. There are many resources available to help you, from printed material to workshops, sponsored by Allen Organ Dealers, the American Guild of Organists, and other organizations. One of the best resources is the hymnal itself. It is helpful to own a variety of hymnals like those you have seen on this video, so that you will have hymns in different keys and settings at your fingertips. Some hymnals have also expanded the types of resources they include. The New Baptist hymnal, for example, has an appendix in the organ edition which includes introductions, interludes, modulations, and transitions to create hymn medleys. And many hymnals now include descants and additional planning resources. Paul Westermeyer, in his excellent book, The Church Musician, warns against becoming an organ grinder who simply cranks out the congregational music each Sunday. It doesn't require a phenomenal technique or an enormous organ to play hymns well, simply a desire to help the congregation constantly sing to the Lord a new song. Happy hymn playing!